The eighth tutor walked out of the billionaire's mansion before lunch, pale and shaking, leaving behind a broken tablet and one sentence that would haunt everyone in the house. He said the girl was not impossible to teach because she was unintelligent. She was impossible to reach because somewhere along the way, she had learned that trusting anyone was more dangerous than failing at everything. 12-year-old Brielle Langford stood at the top of the wide staircase, watching another adult disappear through the front doors, her face empty and hard. Her father, Grant Langford, owned companies, buildings, and investments worth more money than most people could imagine. Yet he stood in that bright marble hallway feeling completely powerless. He could solve problems with contracts, lawyers, and numbers. He could rescue failing businesses. But he could not make his own daughter open a book, speak honestly about her pain, or believe that anyone would stay once she pushed them away. If this story touches your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel if you believe in kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances, because sometimes the person everyone calls difficult is simply carrying a wound nobody has been willing to understand. Brielle had not always been this way. Years earlier, she had been curious, bright, and endlessly talkative. She had loved puzzles, science experiments, and filling notebooks with strange inventions she hoped to build someday. Then her mother, Eliza, became seriously ill. During the long months of treatments and hospital visits, Brielle had watched the adults around her become frightened and distracted. Her father worked even harder, trying to control the one thing he understood, money. He hired specialists, arranged the best care, and made sure Brielle had everything she could possibly need. But what Brielle wanted most could not be purchased. She wanted her father to sit beside her when she was scared. She wanted someone to explain why her mother kept getting weaker. She wanted somebody to promise that her life would not suddenly fall apart. Then, one spring morning, Eliza died, and Brielle's world did exactly that. Grant loved his daughter deeply, but grief made him retreat into work. He convinced himself that providing more was the same as being present. The house filled with staff, tutors, counselors, and specialists. Brielle, meanwhile, became quieter. Then she became angry. She stopped completing assignments. She deliberately gave wrong answers to questions she knew perfectly well. When tutors corrected her, she mocked them. When they became strict, she refused to speak. When they tried to understand her, she accused them of pretending to care. One after another, they gave up. By the time summer arrived, Grant had begun to panic. Brielle was falling behind in school despite being intelligent enough to excel. More importantly, she seemed to be disappearing behind a wall nobody could cross. Every expert gave Grant a different strategy. Some recommended discipline. Others recommended freedom. One suggested removing every distraction from her life. Another insisted she needed more stimulating educational challenges. Grant tried everything, but the more people attempted to fix Brielle, the more fiercely she resisted. Miles Corbett entered the Langford estate without knowing he was about to change either of their lives. At 38, Miles was a single father raising his 9-year-old son, Owen, after losing his wife, Tessa, to a sudden illness 3 years earlier. He had once served as a Navy SEAL, but he rarely spoke about that part of his life. After leaving the military, he had taken whatever honest work allowed him to remain close to his son. He had repaired equipment, worked security, taught basic fitness classes, and done maintenance jobs. His current work came through a facilities company that had a contract with several properties owned by Grant Langford. Miles was fixing a damaged irrigation control box near the garden when he heard something crash inside the glass conservatory. He looked up and saw Brielle standing beside a small table covered in books. Another tutor had left minutes earlier, and the girl was angrily sweeping papers onto the floor. Miles should have continued working. Instead, he noticed something unusual. Among the scattered pages was a complicated mathematics problem. Brielle had crossed out her correct answer and replaced it with an obviously wrong one. Miles stepped inside only long enough to collect a piece of paper that had blown toward the open garden door. Brielle immediately told him to leave. He did not argue. He simply looked at the equation and casually mentioned that the original answer she had crossed out was correct. That made her freeze. For several seconds, Brielle stared at him as if he had broken an important rule. Most adults either criticized her work or praised her intelligence. Miles had done neither. He had simply noticed. She demanded to know how he knew. Miles told her that numbers did not care whether someone was rich, angry, lonely, or pretending not to care. If the answer was right, it was right. Brielle asked why he thought she had changed it. Miles shrugged and said maybe she had a reason. That answer bothered her more than any lecture could have. She waited for him to say something comforting or clever. Instead, he returned to the broken irrigation system. The next afternoon, Brielle found him near the service garage and asked him another math question. Miles answered it while tightening a bolt. The day after that, she brought him a science worksheet. He did not turn the interaction into a lesson. He did not tell Grant. He did not congratulate her. He simply answered when she asked and left her alone when she did not. Within 2 weeks, Brielle began appearing near wherever Miles happened to be working. She would arrive with a book tucked under one arm and an expression that tried very hard to look uninterested. Sometimes she asked about mathematics. Sometimes she asked about navigation, physics, or how machines worked. Miles answered honestly, but he never allowed her to hide behind intelligence when the conversation touched something more personal. One afternoon, Brielle asked why he had left the Navy. Miles was quiet for a moment before explaining that some parts of life teach you how quickly everything can change. After years of service, he had wanted to spend more time being a father. She asked if he missed it. Miles admitted that he missed the people, the purpose, and the sense of knowing that others depended on him. But he told her that Owen depended on him too, and sometimes the bravest decision was choosing where you were needed most. Brielle listened carefully. When Grant eventually discovered that his maintenance worker had somehow become the only person his daughter willingly studied with, he was suspicious. He demanded to know who Miles was and why Brielle was spending time with him. After learning about his military background, Grant offered him a large salary to become Brielle's private tutor. Miles refused. Grant was stunned. Miles explained that Brielle did not need another highly paid professional arriving with a plan to repair her. She needed consistency. If Grant turned their fragile connection into another business arrangement, Brielle might believe it had all been an act. Grant had spent his entire adult life using money to create solutions. Hearing someone refuse it was unsettling. Yet for the first time, he began to wonder whether he had been trying to purchase answers to a problem that required something much simpler. Time. Miles eventually agreed to help Brielle study for a few hours each week, but only if the arrangement remained honest and if Grant stopped treating every moment as a performance report. There would be no demanding progress updates and no pressure placed on Brielle to prove she was improving. At first, their lessons barely resembled lessons. Miles used practical problems. They measured distances across the property, calculated the force required to move equipment, and studied patterns in the garden. He showed her how the same principles behind equations could explain bridges, engines, navigation, and even simple decisions made under pressure. But Miles also noticed when Brielle began shutting down. Instead of pushing harder, he taught her something he had learned during training. When a situation becomes overwhelming, you do not have to solve your entire life in one moment. You find the next stable step. Then the next one. Brielle slowly began applying that idea beyond schoolwork. Her grades improved, but the greatest change was in the way she looked at people. She began speaking to the household staff instead of walking past them. She spent more time outside. She even asked her father to have lunch with her one afternoon, something she had not done willingly in years. Grant arrived late. Only 15 minutes late, but Brielle had already left the table when he entered the dining room. That afternoon, Miles found Grant standing alone near the garden. The billionaire expected criticism, and this time Miles gave it. He told Grant that Brielle had spent years testing whether people would choose her when something else demanded their attention. Every tutor had failed the test in a different way. Grant had failed it too, not because he did not love her, but because he kept assuming love would be understood without being shown. The words hit Grant harder than any business loss ever had. For the first time since Eliza's death, he stopped defending himself. He went upstairs and found Brielle in her room. He did not arrive with gifts or promises. He did not explain how busy he had been. He simply admitted that he had been afraid. He told her he had believed that if he worked hard enough, he could protect her from pain. When he realized he could not save her mother, he had buried himself in the only world where problems seemed manageable. Brielle did not immediately forgive him. And that was important. Grant finally understood that forgiveness was not something he could request like a favor. Trust had to be rebuilt through choices repeated over time. The next weeks were difficult. Some days Brielle was warm. Other days she became distant again. But Grant kept showing up. He had breakfast with her. He attended her study sessions when invited and stayed away when she wanted space. He reduced his travel. He learned that being present did not mean controlling the conversation. Sometimes it meant sitting quietly and allowing his daughter to decide when she was ready to speak. Then came the school's advanced academic assessment, the same type of evaluation Brielle had previously refused to complete. Grant worried that the pressure would cause her to shut down again. On the morning of the assessment, Brielle stood outside the testing room, staring at the door with panic rising in her eyes. Miles was not allowed inside. For a moment, Grant expected Brielle to walk away. Instead, she remembered what Miles had taught her. She did not have to conquer the entire test. She only needed the next stable step. She opened the door. Hours later, the results stunned the educators. Brielle had performed far above her grade level in mathematics and science. But when the school representative excitedly described her achievement, Brielle's first response was not pride. She asked whether her father had waited for her. Grant was sitting in the hallway. When Brielle stepped outside, he stood immediately. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Brielle walked toward him and allowed herself to be held. Grant closed his eyes, knowing that this small moment meant more than any deal he had ever completed. Miles watched from a distance and quietly left, believing his work was finished. But Brielle found him before he reached the parking area. She handed him a folded page filled with calculations and diagrams. It was a design for a small learning workshop she wanted to create one day for children who struggled in school and felt as though adults had already decided who they were. Miles looked at the page and smiled. Brielle told him she had not really needed someone to teach her everything. She had needed someone to believe she was still worth teaching. That was when Miles finally understood why their paths had crossed. Years earlier, military service had taught him how to remain calm when everything around him felt impossible. Losing his wife had taught him how grief could make people disappear into themselves. Raising Owen alone had taught him that children rarely needed perfect parents. They needed adults who kept coming back. Grant eventually offered Miles a new role, but this time it was not about fixing a problem with money. Together, they helped create a small educational program for children from struggling families, providing tutoring, mentoring, and emotional support. Brielle helped choose the first books for the program. Owen became one of her closest friends. And Grant, once known as a man who could command an entire room, learned how to sit beside his daughter and listen without trying to solve every word she said. Before we reach the end, I would love to know your thoughts. What do you believe a hurting child needs most from the adults around them? Answers, discipline, protection, or simply someone who refuses to give up on them? Leave a meaningful comment and share the lesson that stayed with your heart. Months later, on a bright afternoon, Brielle sat with Grant and Miles outside the new learning center as children filled the rooms with noise, questions, and laughter. She looked different, not because all her pain had disappeared, but because she no longer carried it alone. Her mother was still gone. The grief had not been erased. Grant could not reclaim the years he had spent hiding inside his work. But the future was no longer defined by everything they had lost. Sometimes the impossible is not solved by brilliance, money, authority, or force. Sometimes the person who changes a life is simply the one who notices the correct answer before it is crossed out, sees the pain behind the anger, and stays long enough for trust to return. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Because kindness can reach places that success cannot, forgiveness can begin even after years of distance, and hope often starts the moment one person decides that another person is not too broken, too difficult, or too lost to be understood. And on that bright afternoon, surrounded by children learning that mistakes did not make them failures, Brielle finally understood the lesson that had changed her life: the right teacher does not always arrive with the perfect plan. Sometimes they arrive quietly, carrying their own scars, and simply stay.